The standard in gastroenterology, actually, over 1,000 clinical trials happen per year in gastroenterology, where the outcomes are dependent on patients observing their stool with their eyes and writing down on a survey what are the results. We also did a validation study where we compared the patients versus the AI relative to two human gastroenterologists. And we showed that the AI is better than the patients, which is not rocket science in an AI. They annotated 250 images of stool themselves on 5 different dimensions to provide the source of truth. And that's where we showed the comparison of the AI versus the patients. The AI is far more accurate than patients at predicting what a human gastroenterologist would predict.
Asaf Kraus, founder CEO of Dieta Health. I'm so excited to have you on the Scope Forward show. Very, very warm welcome.
Thanks, Praveen. It's great to be with you. I've listened to a lot of your episodes with some of the big innovators in gastroenterology and appreciate everything you do for the community. So I'm excited for this conversation as well.
Thank you. Asaf, you're an AI guy. So I thought, I'd have an AI introduce you. So let's listen to my AI assistant, Jenny, talk about you first.
Awesome.
Asaf Kraus, the dynamic CEO and co-founder of Dieta Health, is not just a visionary leader. He's also a data wizard with a personal story that fuels his fervor. Living with IBS himself, Asaf has turned his challenge into a driving force behind Dieta Health's groundbreaking mission, revolutionizing digestive health through the power of data and AI. With a rich 8-year journey in the realm of data science, Asaf has been the mastermind behind extracting pivotal insights for tech giants like Uber, Accenture, and Trulia. His world took a dramatic turn in 2017 when he was diagnosed with severe IBS. This personal health odyssey wasn't just a battle with symptoms, it was a deep dive into the world of gastroenterology, revealing a startling gap in data-driven personalization in treatment approaches. During countless consultations with GI experts and navigating through a maze of complex treatments, Asaf had an epiphany. He saw a future where AI doesn't just play a role, but leads the way in gastroenterology care. That's the future Dieta Health is passionately crafting today, a future where data isn't just numbers, but a key to unlocking personalized, effective solutions for digestive health challenges. Asaf's journey is more than just professional. It's a personal crusade to transform the landscape of gastroenterology, making it smarter, more tailored, and, ultimately, more human.
That was pretty good. She did a better job than I could do at describing myself there. I'm curious what training data fed her. Is that scraping the internet, my LinkedIn, a bunch of other things?
No, a lot of people have this question, so I'm going to do a reveal. What I do is I take your bio and I feed it to generative AI and ask it to make it fun and enthusiastic, but keep it professional. So I get my content and I feed it back to the avatar AI or the digital assistant thing. And then I just make her talk. So I use a variety of tools, I play with them. And this is a way for me to feel like I'm using it. It's so much fun.
That's really cool. I may need to steal that tactic from you for various presentations.
So, Asaf, when did you actually found Dieta Health?
So definitely started actually thinking of it while I was still employed at Uber in 2017, 2018, and early 2019 is when we really got started with the company. So about 4.5 years.
And it's been quite an amazing journey, and I'm excited to learn a lot about it. My first question I want to kick us off with is, you were an engineer at Uber doing machine learning. Who would think about taking stool pictures and applying, machine learning to stool pictures? For all things stool. I know I'm making light of perhaps a personal situation, but I do want to learn more.
No, totally. It's definitely okay to make fun of it. It's something we get often, and it is something that's kind of pretty random to people when they first hear about it. But original story for how we came about in doing this is very personal to me, and it came from my own experience in the real world with gastroenterology. So in the beginning of 2017, like you mentioned, I was working as a data scientist at Uber and found myself in this like super entrepreneurial and innovative environment where Uber had this kind of company culture of everybody was an entrepreneur. It was kind of like the bad boy of Silicon Valley at the time. The company was challenging governments around the world, challenging a lot of norms about how to build a company internally as well with its culture. And so I loved being a part of that. And obviously, I loved my actual job and the content I was working on, which is analyzing billions of Uber trips and using the data from Uber to predict things. Then in the beginning of 2017, I was afflicted with very severe IBS. Sure, your audience is the GI community knows all about this story, so I don't need to tell them, what they've already heard a million times from millions of IBS patients. But for me, this kind of gradually crept up and then became super severe all of a sudden, where it completely took over my life. So I started sleeping 4 hours per night. I was spending 2 or 3 hours a day sitting on the toilet with multiple runs to the toilet every day, trying unsuccessfully to have bowel movements. This was getting in the way of my dating life. It ruined a vacation I had to Japan, where I had to come back early to actually do a colonoscopy because I was just like, I shouldn't even be vacationing now. I should be working on solving this big problem I have. So for a period of 10 months, roughly, IBS completely stole my life. Basically, I felt like all I had was my job at Uber because I wanted to stay employed, make money, and have health insurance, and trying to solve my own IBS. So I was incessantly nagging gastroenterologists, my primary care doctor, dietitian. I was ordering dozens of supplements from Amazon, trying all the prescription medications, trying all these radical diets. Like the only goal of my life became solving my own IBS, basically, and earning my life back. I spent the year being basically obsessed with IBS, and that's where we started working on this. So to kind of bring it forward, talking about stool images and like how do we get to stool images specifically, one of the first kind of moments or started thinking of IBS as a data science problem is I went into my private practice gastroenterologist office, and he first told me to record a journal of what I'm eating and my bowel movements. And then he pointed to a chart of the Bristol stool scale in his office. It was the 1 through 7 diagram. 1 is pure constipation, 7 is diarrhea, and 4 is the perfect bowel movement. And I had never heard of this. And actually, my stool actually didn't really fit the mold of what the Bristol scale described. So either have diarrhea on one side or constipation on the other side. But there's actually multiple variables. There's how liquid or solid your stool is, how fragmented or consolidated, is it one piece or many piece? Is it big or small? Is it fuzzy or is it clear? There's also the frequency of it. So we have these 2 words, diarrhea and constipation, to describe the problem with bowel movements. But this is actually, I just listed 5 dimensions of the stool for you. So it's a 5-dimensional plane, not a 1-dimensional thing. So that's where I started thinking of this idea, like, why are we just categorizing it on one scale as opposed to multiple? And a little bit later in that year, I actually participated in the clinical trial of a pharmaceutical company. So out of desperation, I made myself into a lab rat for a pharma. And I noticed then that the patients looking at their stool and recording it on a physical survey, this is how the FDA is going to evaluate, did this drug actually improve this patient's stool? And at like 4 bowel movements per day, I was asked to remember each one and categorize it on the Bristol scale. Then, kind of obviously, as a data scientist, I thought computers that have computer vision can analyze images of stool in a much more superior way than humans can, with more accuracy, with less subjectivity, because it's one computer system looking at everyone's stool, so individual bias doesn't come into play. And most importantly, it's more detailed, multidimensional data. So that's kind of the backbone for the idea of Dieta and stool image recognition AI.
Very fascinating and inspiring. I see this trend across the board now, not just in gastroenterology. What I call it as patients becoming providers. You're not a clinician, but you are providing care by putting together a system that doesn't exist in our existing system. You put together a program, a system that solves the problem for other patients like you. Now, do you observe this trend as well, and any reflections on that?
Definitely. I mean, I think in the community, we see a lot of patients that have become entrepreneurs. Think about these companies like Google and Facebook and Meta, Uber, some of these other Silicon Valley companies. The statistic is that 1 out of 5 Americans has IBS, and 1 to 2% of Americans have IBD as well. So within these companies that you see a lot of people that know, see machine learning all around them and various other technologies that are relevant, not just AI. Obviously, I think a lot of people are getting inspired to kind of want to build that in the medical space. And I think that's a very positive trend overall. There's more demand for the time of a gastroenterologist than there are gastroenterologists that can deliver on it. There's the statistic in IBS is that 70% of people that have IBS live with it undiagnosed, and they don't go and get care. There's also this huge degree of shame and embarrassment that contributes to it as well. They'd rather open an incognito window on Google and search, how do I solve diarrhea and constipation? What if my stool looks like this? What if my stool looks like that? Rather than admit to another human being that they have that problem. So obviously, technology can step in there and solve some of those problems.
And I want to ask you, how exactly did your problem go away, or after figuring it out, what exactly happened?
For me, I went on this kind of journey of randomness, is kind of how I call it. Where I tried one thing after another. It's interventions for IBS. There's diets, medications, supplements, and lifestyle changes. Lifestyle changes like things like intermittent fasting, for example. I had tried a few dozen supplements that I ordered from Amazon, probably about 10 prescription medications that were prescribed to me by doctors, and a couple of the radical diets. And for me, it was just a constant search of, that there's hundreds of interventions that are available. And I was looking on Reddit, for example, to see the stories of other patients. For every one of those 100+ interventions, you'll find a group of patients that said, this diet cured me. You'll find some people that say, I stopped eating meat and that cured me. And you'll find some people that said, I only eat meat and that cured me. So for me, this became kind of like a recommender system problem to solve in terms of like, which patients am I similar to? Because there's other patients out there that have the same type of IBS that I have, and let me learn what solved them. Eventually, I found my thing is called methane predominant SIBO, or what's now known as IMO. More and more research coming about this, and a set of interventions specifically for that, antibiotics. That's what was a step function change, and it gave me my life back. 80% of the way resolved my symptoms. But how that pertains to what we're doing at Dieta is the concept of subdiagnosis. So IBS currently has 4 subdiagnoses: diarrhea, constipation, alternating, and mixed. And the way you diagnose a patient with IBS-C is you look at the Bristol stool chart. You say, is over 25% of your bowel movements type 1 and type 2? Now you're classified as IBS-C. If we know a patient is IBS-C versus D, you could make a very simple recommendation, like if you have diarrhea, you should eat more rice. And if you have constipation, you should eat more prunes, because that's a laxative. You get a little bit more better information when you can categorize patients into different smaller groups. And what we've done with Dieta on that front is actually create some more granular groups of patients. As an example of that, with one pharmaceutical company that used the stool image recognition AI to measure the results of their clinical trial, they did an IBS-D clinical trial. So it's already one of the subsets of IBS, but we were able to take that group of patients and split it into 3 more detailed groups of patients and show them your drug really works for group A, moderate works for group B, and it doesn't work at all for group C. This concept of grouping patients appropriately works even better when you have multidimensional data to cluster them on. That's something that I think could be really rapidly improved, so you can understand with much more detail, this patient belongs to this specific group, and patients of that specific group really benefit from that medication or that diet or that supplement.
Talk a little bit more about how Dieta Health itself works as a platform.
The platform is not just stool image recognition. The stool image recognition is the app guides you with a cartoon toilet seat on photographing your stool as a patient. You take a picture. It's anonymous in most cases, unless you want to give the app your identity. And it's encrypted and secure and private. It's not saved on the camera roll of your iPhone. So it's not like your friends are going to find pictures of your diarrhea on there. And that data then is stored in the backend. It could be transmitted to your gastroenterologist or your care team. And the AI then that we've built classifies your stool. It currently classifies it on 5 objective clinical data points that we have validated in clinical trials. So that is the Bristol stool scale and 4 more granular characteristics of the stool. And we're developing more and more of these characteristics. You could think of these like liquid to solid. Is there blood in the stool? Is there mucus in the stool? Is it clear stool, which is relevant to for colonoscopy prep? Different colors of the stool are relevant to different liver and pancreas diseases. So multidimensional stool image recognition, and that's one part of it. On top of that, we've also built an entire platform for managing telemedicine interactions that pertain to gastroenterology care. So there's also a chat component in the app where a patient can chat with a set of clinicians. They can also take photos of their meals, and we have some computer vision that categorizes meals. So you can take photos of all your meals, you could take photos of all your bowel movements, and then start to learn the relationships between what you're eating and how it's affecting your stool. There's also a survey mechanism. And finally, there's a clinician portal. So that's where gastroenterologists and researchers open that up on a computer and they see the data of the patients that are assigned to them. They can analyze that data, export it, depends on what purpose they're using that data for.
How does the company or what you do differ from other startups that are approaching IBS?
As far as we know, we're the first and only clinically validated stool image recognition AI that is on a mobile app. There are a couple other companies that make smart toilets, for example. So, actual hardware you install. There's a bit of definitely pros and cons to each approach. The pros of a smart toilet is angle and the lighting and a lot of the other conditions of the pictures you take is definitely a lot more standardized. So they can probably have uniform data that results from it. The biggest drawback is it requires hardware, which is a cost, and it's installed in one place. So ours is on a smartphone and you can download it with a QR code very easily. If a pharma company is, say, running a clinical trial where they just need 2 months worth of stool image results for a patient that's taking an experimental medication, it's a very low cost to distribute the software to the phones. If a patient is going to use it in advance of a colonoscopy to guide their colonoscopy prep and make sure that they're clear and they're going to have a successful colonoscopy, you only need the software on your phone for 3 days in advance of your colonoscopy. So, because colonoscopy prep is a short but high dollar value experience. So that's kind of the benefit of software on a phone analyzing your stool.
Talking a little bit more about your business model, do you make money? Do you generate revenues? And who do you sell to?
We're currently targeting 2 different business segments. One is selling to pharmaceutical companies and academic medical centers that are running clinical trials. And the other is selling to providers that are doing colonoscopies. And so I'll start with the longer standing business model that we've already seen a lot of success with is the pharmaceutical and clinical trial space. We started at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, which we also have as an investor through the Cedars-Sinai Accelerator Program. And we did our first clinical trial there where we demonstrated to one pharma company that the standard in gastroenterology, actually, over 1,000 clinical trials happen per year in gastroenterology, where the outcomes are dependent on patients observing their stool with their eyes and writing down on a survey what are the results. For IBS, it's a Bristol stool scale. For IBD, there's things like the Mayo Clinic Disease Activity Index for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, where you look for blood in the stool, mucus in the stool, how liquid is it? And so a lot of clinical trials, their outcomes depend on patients looking at their stool. And so we've demonstrated that you can use the Dieta app instead of the patient observation. You can get much more accurate results. And in that first clinical trial at Cedars-Sinai, we also did a validation study where we compared the patients versus the AI relative to 2 human gastroenterologists. And we showed that the AI is better than the patients, which is not rocket science in an AI. The patients are pretty prone to error. So in that front, we've run successful clinical trials at Cedars-Sinai, Mayo Clinic, the VA, and recently University of Michigan. And we have a bunch more pharmaceutical and academic medical researchers that are using the product to generate superior data on their clinical trials. One last thing I should mention on the benefit of doing that is also understanding those more detailed subgroups. So pharma companies developing drugs usually just have to rely on the patient observation. They also get less granular data. But with ours, they really understand which groups of patients from before the drug was given to them ended up benefiting from the drug, which can impact their probability of actually bringing the drug to market. So that's all on the pharma side. Recently, one doctor, actually the doctor that initially introduced you and I, Dr. Mehta in Chicago, he kind of came to us with this idea of like, let's use stool image recognition for colonoscopy prep. So we've recently opened this kind of idea of running one clinical trial with him. Then we have 3 doctors that are going to be launching this soon. And early 2024, we're really going to launch this as a product line. 200 million colonoscopies happen around the world every year. The average cost in the US is about $3,000 per colonoscopy. And studies show that between 10 to 25% of those colonoscopies are improperly prepared, meaning the patient hasn't drinking enough laxatives, they haven't had enough diarrhea. And when the gastroenterologist goes in, they can't actually make a diagnosis because there's still stool inside of the patient. So you can probably tell when you look at stool coming out into the toilet with this Dieta stool image recognition, can that be predictive of who's going to succeed or fail at a colonoscopy? And so we've been running a clinical trial. We're not ready to share results or publish it quite yet, but it is looking promising. I mean, you can think of it kind of logically. We're packaging up the product in a way where The patient photographs their stool in the 3 days leading up to the colonoscopy. The app gives them education and guidance on how to actually prepare for their colonoscopy. And they're chatting with a Dieta Health coach in the app that's available 24/7 for them. Gastroenterologists complain to us that patients call them at 5 a.m. the night before colonoscopy all the time, and they ask the same questions over and over again. So now the app is going to answer those repetitive questions instead of the gastroenterologist. So that package of software and a service, we are starting to sell that to providers who are performing colonoscopies.
Share a little bit more about the validation studies and the clinical studies. I'm interested to know, what did you learn from those studies? Like you as individually, as well as Dieta as a team.
So that first major validation study that I told you about is the one with Dr. Mark Pimentel at Cedars-Sinai, who was kind of the first doctor I came to with the idea of taking photos of stool. And I initially came into his office and kind of told him, this is the idea, right? Like a gastroenterologist told me to look at the Bristol scale, and I wasn't okay with that. So this is what I'm working on. And he kind of came at it from a different angle. He said, his famous words to me were, I don't trust my patient. He's been running GI clinical trials for 20 years. Is the doctor that's credited with coming up with rifaximin as a treatment for SIBO, which is, one of the biggest products in the market for IBS. And he's been running clinical trials for 20 years, and he has to believe the patient. So for him, the subjectivity of patients was the problem. For me, it was more of the multidimensional versus one-dimensional thing was the problem. But so he agreed to do our first validation study. He and Dr. Zayed Cedars, they annotated 250 images of stool themselves on 5 different dimensions to provide the source of truth. And that's where we showed the comparison of the AI versus the patients. The AI is far more accurate than patients at predicting what a human gastroenterologist would predict. And like I told you before, I think that aspect of it, that the AI's accuracy over the individual patients, isn't that hard of a problem to solve. But some of the other things that surprised me about that study were the patient's willingness to photograph their stools. So I knew that I'm crazy because, to build the technology, I took photos of my own stool for 2 years. And when there was no AI to classify it, I was just taking photos of stool and then nothing would happen. So I knew that I'm crazy, but are other patients going to be willing to do this when they're instructed to? We gave them pamphlets that describe what to do. And we played them a little animated video on an iPad in the clinic for 1 minute. And that made them comfortable. Okay, I'm taking photos of my stool because these researchers are trying to understand what's going to happen, to my bowel movements after I take this drug. So patient behavior being successful was pleasantly surprising to me in that first clinical trial, as well as obviously the AI results being superior to the patients. Then we ran a couple other clinical trials as well. We did ulcerative colitis with Dr. Gil Melmed at Cedars-Sinai, the head of IBD there. And we took hospitalized, acute, severe ulcerative colitis patients. So this is when they come in the most severe state. Some of them were having an average of 12 bowel movements per day as measured by the app. They're having blood in the stool, mucus in the stool. And in that clinical trial, we found statistically significant correlations between the output of Dieta's analysis of their stool and their blood CRP, the main inflammation biomarker in the blood. So that showed that monitoring their stool could be a non-invasive way to monitor IBD disease activity. And then we've also recently done a couple validation studies at the VA in Virginia and at Mayo Clinic, Drs. Bajaj and Dr. Simonetto, respectively. Those is on a liver condition, cirrhosis, where the doctors typically ask the patients to look at their stool and have it be in a Bristol stool chart range, and then titrate a dose of lactulose medication to make sure that they prevent hepatic encephalopathy. So we ran this study with a different disease. I was also a little bit, okay, these are not even GI patients, they're liver disease patients. Are they going to take photographs of their stool? And we also found success there, that the AI was more accurate than the patients. It was successful in guiding them in their dosage of lactulose. The clinical trial at Mayo Clinic was just presented yesterday, the liver meeting in Boston by Dr. Simonetto and his team. Yeah, we're doing more and more validation studies on different diseases. We're soon going to be included in an oncology clinical trial with a opioid-induced constipation medication, because constipation is a big problem for cancer treatments. So there's other categories of diseases where stool is relevant, and Dieta can play a role in measuring the outcomes of their stool.
Fascinating. I can easily see it spreading in many, many different directions, because stool would be relevant pretty much to most disease conditions, and physicians would want to know numbers that you can share, Asaf, like, so any kind of numbers, like, so how many images or how many patients?
We currently have about 300,000 annotated stool images.
Mhm.
So one thing that's special about the data set, that's come from around 25,000 patients. During the time that the data has been collected, the app has progressively improved the experience of the app, your ability to share it with your gastroenterologist, the way that it's classified with the number of variables, et cetera. So the number of stool images per patient is constantly rising as in part of the graph too. What makes that data set special is not just the number of stool images, but also the variety and the annotations on them. So we have a data set of ulcerative colitis patients, we have IBS-D patients, we have constipated patients, we have cirrhosis patients, we have a set of healthy people that actually, we did a clinical trial that involved people that don't have any GI disease photograph in their stool to quantify what does healthy stool look like. So we're more interested, definitely would love to get to 1 million stool images because that's a cool number to say, but it's also the diversity of the data set, also tracking how does stool change when you introduce a medication to a patient, the fluctuations in the stool characteristics. And that's come from about 25,000 patients so far. So we're looking forward to getting into more medical centers where we're doing clinical trials and helping academics. Just one study that we're going to be starting soon is going to be a decentralized clinical trial that includes 10,000 patients. So obviously that's going to be growing the data set. And with the colonoscopy program that I told you about, it's also, every gastroenterologist tells me that on average, they're doing 10 to 20 colonoscopies per day. And every single one of those times that they schedule a colonoscopy for a patient, they tell the patient, look in the toilet bowl and assess your stool, and that's how you're going to know if you're ready for your colonoscopy. So we also are very excited about that product because it can get in the hands of many patients and make a big impact on colonoscopies.
I'm curious to know, as with everything with AI, initially it starts with an algorithm, but then the algorithm starts getting refined, at a human or manual scale or level. When you're trying to identify something, categorize something, you may categorize as, let's say, 5 types as in stool scale. But what AI can possibly offer is the various finer gradations that the human eye wouldn't be able to spot. Have you had any such insights? Like maybe with the aid of, like, so when you 10x this, you have 300,000, like, so it gets to 3 million and beyond. Would we be able to even evolve the common clinical measure, something on those lines? Have those thoughts occurred to you?
Yeah, definitely. There's almost like two ways I can answer this question from the kind of data science angle. One is on the granularity of each variable, and the other is on a clustering of many variables. So on the granularity of each variable, to describe to you kind of how we developed the AI and what you're saying, like, can the AI be more detailed than the human, right? If I understood your question correctly, I started doing the annotations myself. We built an annotation portal where you look at one stool image and say we looked at consistency of stool. So we have a variable. If you use the Dieta app now, you could take a photo of your stool and you could see this happen. It's a 0 to 100 where 0 is liquid and solid, right? We annotated those in terms of increments of 10 as a discrete variable. So 0, 10, 20, 30. And in the Dieta annotation portal, you'd look at a picture of a given bowel movement, and on the side, you'd see what does a 10 look like, what does a 20 look like, what does a 30 look like, with 11 classes. We annotated the data as a discrete variable because a human, it's easier to make a decision. But that data then, when you have hundreds of thousands of stool images, can be trained to, similar to linear regression, output a continuous variable. It'll eventually know if it has enough pictures of a 50 and it has enough pictures of a 60, what does a 57.2 look like? And that's what the Dieta AI already does now. It actually classifies those categories that were trained as discrete. It predicts a continuous variable. Sorry if that got a little too detailed. And then the other side of it is on clustering the patients. So I think I mentioned to you before, for one pharmaceutical client, we made 3 clusters of IBS-D patients that are more detailed groups of patients. On those, we did a 12-dimensional clustering of different stool characteristics and their variances. So the variance, if you think about it, like the variance of your stool fragmentation is one day you have one piece of stool and the next day you have 70 pieces of stool in a bowel movement. And then the next day it's 2 and the next day is 90. Is there a high fluctuation in your fragmentation or fluctuation in your consistency? A 12-dimensional clustering, and it's going to get more and more as we add more and more variables, was able to show them that the fluctuations in some of the stool characteristics were predictive of who was going to succeed in using their medication. to reduce their diarrhea. So that's also something like the human eye is not going to detect that, because we obviously can't even process what is a 12-dimensional space. But when you give a computer tons of data, it can start to say, this is a cluster of patients that really benefit from this drug. So I think that has a lot of promise in personalizing digestive health, which is Dieta's mission.
One more question comes to mind. In my book, Scope Forward, I've written a whole chapter on Convergence, where different exponential technologies start merging. There is a startup that's coming up. Dr. Larry Kozinski's startup, he presented at the ACG, which is an electronic e-nose. Just curious, more like a thought experiment. What would happen if you combine this AI that's identifying information or insights through images, through vision, you combine it with smell, and is completely new or different insights that doesn't exist today? How do you think it's going to shift the game, or any thoughts, reflections? And you can say it's a stupid question, I won't mind.
No, I don't think it's stupid at all. I think that's incredible, because actually you can probably even see this on the Dieta app today. But in the first version of the Dieta app, you take a photo of your stool, and we know that not everything is visual. There's other things, including your smell. We actually had a slider in the app where the patient would rate how bad do they think it smelled. And I never actually really regarded that as being a very important variable, but obviously people know that's a thing, right? Like that's either 100 out of 100 the smell, or it's a 0 out of 100. At Dieta, we've done in a bunch of our validation studies, we've correlated the visual characteristics of your stool to other things. So in Mark Pimentel's clinical trial with the IBS and SIBO patients, we found statistically significant correlations between how your stool looks as analyzed by Dieta and your stool microbiome when the patients actually, submitted a stool sample and it was taken to the lab and tested for their microbiome. And we found different microbiome subtypes from a stool test correlate to how your stool looks. In that study I told you with IBD patients, we correlated the blood CRP in a blood test to your stool appearance. So we're focused on something very specific, which is a smartphone is always in everyone's pocket now. And we want that to replace you using your eyeballs to look at stool and make a decision on how you think it looks. But there's obviously these other characteristics like the smell, what's in your blood, what's in your stool, what's in your breath from the lactulose breath tests. So all these different variables I think will come together. And I've actually never heard of that startup, but if they're interested in collaborating and we can get 50 patients to use that tool and photograph their stools and see what the correlations are, I'm sure that there'd be some interesting findings.
So Asaf, I have a couple of questions, but relating to your technology vision. So given all these different exponential technologies at play that are advancing, for example, augmented reality, one thought that occurred to me is, when you point your smartphone to the stool and take pictures, it's working currently in an offline manner, if you will. So you're uploading the pictures, the AI is analyzing it, much later. But most of smartphone technology is going to be embedded with augmented reality capabilities. I'm giving you an example. So you might be, let's say in the future, take pictures, and at the same time, the AI is analyzing then and there, because maybe there are AI chips embedded within smartphones in the future. That's the direction things are going. The patient may be able to get insights then and there. I love your reflections on this, and I want to connect the dots to a broader question on what is your technology vision for Dieta Health.
Currently, actually, the Dieta app will give you feedback on your stool within 10 seconds, usually. That's because, it's uploaded to the cloud, it's analyzed there, and then it's downloaded to your phone. Some of the newer technologies that are coming out, there's a new React Native camera and specific framework for mobile development that one of my engineers is actually working on implementing right now, where it will actually be in real time. The larger AI model that we have that classifies the validated 5 characteristics, that currently is something that won't fit on your phone, or it'll take up too much of your memory on your iPhone. You don't want it there. We just developed a different model, for example, that just tells you, is this stool or not? So we did those hepatic encephalopathy patients that I mentioned at Mayo Clinic and the VA. And that disease leads to a little bit of confusion, and it's in a bit of an older population than IBS patients. So sometimes they took pictures of the floor. They missed the toilet, and it'll tell you, hold on, you took a picture of non-stool, try again. That's an example of you need some real-time feedback. And we've actually just developed that, tested it, and it's accurate. And we're going to put that on the front end. So that actual software is sitting on your phone. But I think some of the value creating examples of that is actually real-time like notifications and kind of alerts to the clinical team. So if a patient that previously wasn't having blood in their stool suddenly starts having blood in their stool, that's something that's really relevant to immediately notify their gastroenterologist and them too. You may want to send a note to your gastroenterologist immediately because it looks like there's blood in your stool. There's a different condition that I just heard of just the other day, but when your stool starts turning gray, that could be a very serious condition in which you're going to be hospitalized and have your gallbladder removed. So a couple of these very specific trends that happen, I think we need to have some immediate alerts in there. And then you can more early in the process of a severe disease, get to the clinicians who can help you solve that problem. So that's kind of on the immediate. And the AR question that you asked, then you asked about the kind of the larger vision for the technology. So when we take it back to the beginning of our conversation about like my journey with being an IBS patient, going through that painful year of random experiments, like I told you, just listening to whatever the doctor would say next, or a different doctor or some stranger on Reddit told me to do. My vision for the future of gastroenterology is one where you know some data about yourself as a patient. New people are getting diagnosed with IBS every day or discovering their IBS every day. So in the future, when you start discovering that you have digestive issues, you can give your data to a system, and that system will compare you to the experiences of millions of other GI patients and understand who you're similar to and what solution is most likely to work for you. The approach that we're taking is with the stool image recognition because of what I said about the subdiagnoses of IBS, like really understanding which type of patient you are. If you can take stool images for 3 days and it classifies all these variables and the variances and it understands in the database, these are a bunch of other patients that had a similar condition to you, and this is the solution that solved it for them, we can more quickly get people to get their quality of life back faster and with fewer resources. So that's really the big vision for Dieta.
Kudos to you and your team on that vision, and all the best for making that happen. As we wrap up our conversation, Asaf, one of the questions that keeps popping up in the private practice GI space, clinicians and others have brilliant ideas, but when they wish to go about implementing that, or when they want to innovate, right in the beginning, a question pops up, who's going to pay for that? That's a valid question because the entire private practice GI space is tied to managed care and the reimbursement model, and everyone is looking in that direction. But as a startup, you're quite liberated from that question in a certain way. But how did you figure out funding, and what would you say to somebody who is listening or watching who wants to innovate, but then devil of the question pops up and says, but who's going to pay for it? How did you answer that for yourself, figure it out, and what advice do you have for somebody who wants to innovate out there listening to you right now?
I think it's really important to go and talk to stakeholders first. And I can say I've learned this a little bit, but I'm still actively learning this every day. So it's like I keep thinking that I've learned this concept and then I learn it even more. And that's about going and talking to the stakeholders first before just blindly developing some technology. Said, hey, let's do a little bit of an experiment. Let's build this piece of the app and then see who it's relevant for. But it's always been more just a better idea to go and talk to the potential stakeholder and see who will pay for it first, and then go and actually build that technology. So I've become kind of a master at Figma, the design tool, and I'll design the interface of a piece of the app and go show it to the potential stakeholder first. And not just a piece of the app, but like the whole flow of what every page of the app is going to do, understand the flow of how does that impact their incentives, start with that first. So, for us, pharma and research, a little bit different in the private practice world, in which there's a little bit more of like a willingness to spend on capturing superior data when there's a very clear kind of problem and solution for them. With how I described, there's a standard of them asking their patients to look at their stool, and that causes them errors in their own analysis of their clinical trials. With colonoscopy, which is kind of a new thing that we're learning about, but we understand that there's a very big cost to gastroenterologists when they have unsuccessful colonoscopies. There's patients calling them in the middle of the night. They don't get reimbursed for that. The patients are calling their front office staff with all these questions. They don't get any reimbursement for that. It spends the time of their staff. They can bill for less revenue when they don't do an interventional colonoscopy. They don't have a successful colonoscopy diagnosis for the patient. Looking for something where this problem of unprepared colonoscopies is already costing gastroenterologists a certain number, and we're measuring that number in our clinical trial. We're also capturing how often is the patient interrupting the gastroenterologist in the middle of their day or in the middle of their night. So we're going to quantify that soon. We don't have the official analysis yet, but we hope to publish that next ACG, most likely. So we found kind of a problem where this is already costing them money. And if they use Dieta services, they should be willing to pay a fraction of that ROI for the usage of the software that solves their problem. One additional thing on there, we've been supported by two amazing accelerator programs. The first is the United Healthcare Techstars program. So spent some time in Minneapolis at the United Healthcare headquarters, and they were our first investor. And then the Cedars-Sinai Accelerator in Los Angeles, #2 ranked gastroenterology medical centers. Those two programs, I highly recommend them. They put you in front of a lot of stakeholders. In one world, it's the providers and the pharma represented at Cedars-Sinai, and the payers in United Healthcare. They just really rapidly put you in front of a bunch of business stakeholders, and they teach you how to raise money. So those two programs have been really successful for us. After we did them, we raised a $2 million pre-seed round, and it kind of kickstarted the company. So highly recommend those.
Asaf, as we wrap up our conversation today, my last question to you is, what is the future of gastroenterology from the lens that you're seeing?
Kind of like I said before, I think that it's a future in which fewer resources and a smaller amount of time is required to take a patient from extreme digestive suffering to thriving in their life again because they're not suffering from digestive issues. And I think that that reduction in the resources required is something where if you're a billionaire right now and you have digestive issues, you can get a panel of 10 docs to treat you, right? Give you all the attention. They can read all the clinical trials for you. The order in which they try interventions to treat you is going to be very curated. I think technology can kind of deliver that for everyday people. Similar to kind of, I guess, how you would say like Uber took the experience of a black car that, was reserved for the elites of society and made it so anybody can walk outside and hit a button and a car will come pick you up and take you where you need to go. I think that experience of like concierge healthcare is be more for the masses as the resources required to deliver that type of personalized treatment go down, and AI is a huge part of making that future happen.
Asaf, on that note, thank you so much for coming on the Scope Forward show and sharing these insights. I found them tremendously useful and great to reflect with you on the future of GI.
Thanks, Praveen. Really a pleasure to talk with you today and always, and appreciate everything you're doing. So thanks for having me.